I always take it as a sign of hope and of spring when I get a seed catalog in the mail. I may not always order anything, but the idea of planting seeds that will sprout and that I can put outside in my garden is usually a very necessary antidote to February's doldrums and coughing. I acknowledge that a big part of my own identity is that of a farm child. Our February theme of identity, transition, and transformation draws on my own upbringing and my understanding, nurtured from my childhood, that life is a continual transition. Just like a seed transitions from a small, usually brown or tan casing to what we hope will become a lush green plant that will bear a colorful and abundant harvest some months in the future. But just like the people at Corinth, we want to take credit for that growth and harvest that we planted and watered and tended in our garden. But as Paul writes, and my own experience confirms, seeds often grow and flourish, or not, because of reasons outside of our control. God gives the growth, or not. I remember the year in my childhood that we had a bumper crop of pinto beans, cut and drying in windrows in the field, waiting for the combines to come by and do the thrashing, which separates the beans from the vines and the pods. And then we had a massive windstorm that lifted the dried vines and literally blew most of the crop off the field into the nearby canyon. This field accounted probably for about 1/10 of our crops. So that would have been as if you had gotten paid annually in cash and left it on the table and 1/10 of it blew out the window. I don't remember what my father did next. I think he worked that winter, driving truck and a whole bunch of other things. But also because of the annual nature of our income, I didn't get a traditional weekly allowance as a child, but my allowance came from the sale of the crops from a particular patch of ground known as Nancy's Patch. I also remember that field another year that we got such good rain that the bean vines were knee-high and loaded with pods. Since I got my annual allowance from that patch of ground, that was the year I bought a piano after the crop was sold. Spent the whole year's allowance on the piano. And neither circumstance of the wind blowing away the beans or of the rain increasing the yield had anything to do with my father's abilities as a farmer. Today, as we discovered, most of us don't bother planting seeds, starting seeds, plants from seeds. And we may not even have a garden. How many of you have a garden? Yeah, maybe. Farming or gardening is a series of risky propositions, hoping that enough seeds will sprout, that the seeds get enough but not too much water, nutrients, and light, and that the insects and the birds don't dine on your crops before you get a chance. But even when we go to the nursery to buy plants that someone else started from seeds, we understand that the plant must grow and change. And we can't actually control or dictate how the plant will grow. If we plant a tomato seed or buy a tomato plant, we can't expect to pick a cucumber from that plant. If we plant lettuce when it's too hot, we probably can expect the plant to either wither or bolt and not produce much lettuce. So let me ask you to take a moment to reflect. What spiritual seeds have you welcomed into the garden of your soul, and how have you sought water and light for those seeds? Do you see yourself as someone who is growing spiritually? Do you seek a place or want a place to engage in the moral and ethical concerns that you face in your everyday life? Are you growing in love for God and for your neighbors and yourself? Are you growing in any parts of your life besides maybe your waistband after, too much Thanksgiving holiday carbs? Do you see that nurturing spiritual, emotional, or intellectual growth is important to you? Is it part of your identity to be a person who is growing, changing, and learning in these areas? How do you measure success, say in your job or career or in your life? Are you only focused on financial matters that you can easily measure with the numbers in your bank or investment balances? Because those are easy to measure. And then as a community, we ask, what seeds are we planting and watering? And where is the growth? Some of you may remember that our scripture this morning from 1 Corinthians chapter 3 was part of the call to worship for my installation service it's 2.5 years ago now. And 3 former pastors of this congregation reflected on what seeds they had planted and watered. Our roots go back now 198 years in this place. But on the day of my installation, Ken Witt reflected on the seeds of an expanded commitment to missions during his tenure. Trips to Tennessee for Habitat for Humanity and to Rainbow Acres in Arizona. He recalled our support of 3 congregations and pastors in Romania and the seeds that were planted to consider women as ministry partners and pastors for this church, including Carolyn Webster's administrative ministry. Ken Downs mentioned mission trips to Alaska and to the Dominican Republic during the 1990s, and the seeds of musical varieties of the singing church that were planted during that period with organ and sanctuary renovations, and the fruition of seeds planted with women in pastoral leadership roles with Debbie Blanchard and Joyce Anderson Reed. Debbie Blanchard then celebrated mission work in La Paz, Mexico, and Louisiana to work on cleanup efforts following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and to the Honduras, as well as ministry work with differently abled adults and through animals like Mosby, who was our ministry dog for many years, and in many expressions of music. I know that the seeds of providing food for the community extend back a number of years with our participation in the neighborhood supper and our ham and bean community meals. How long have we been doing neighborhood suppers? So well more than 10 years, yeah. During my nearly 3 years here, we've continued to nurture the seeds of mission with trips to New Jersey and Puerto Rico. We've planted new seeds of community service with the Memory Cafe and our new LGBTQ community support group. We've planted seeds of collaboration with West Acton Baptist Church, with joint services, with the other churches in Littleton with vigils for love, peace, civility, and justice, and with the Town Department of Elder and Human Services and other churches in support of our commitment to be a welcoming and affirming presence for all in our community. We've planted seeds for a safe and nurturing space and welcome people from around the community to our conversations about the hard questions of racism, addiction, mental health, homophobia, domestic violence, suicide, mental illness, and braving the wilderness of our current world. We've begun watering the soil of shared building use with the addition of other tenants. We've recognized that we need to tend the space, the field where we're planting all of these seeds of ministry with our Restoration 2022 campaign to renovate the bathrooms and the sanctuary spaces. We do all of this work of planting and tending with a common purpose in mind. Paul said we had a common purpose. And I'll name that as our desire that God will send growth in our love of God and for our neighbors and ourselves. The tricky thing about growth in a plant and in ourselves is that we can't just measure what is easily visible to decide that growth was good. If a plant shoots up really quickly and becomes too tall, it may not have a good root system to hold it firmly in the soil in case of a sudden rainstorm. When we consider our garden, each of our plants, each of us, needs to be well rooted in order to grow and flourish. And roots are not visible. So the easy measures of growth, like how tall a plant is, or how many people are in the pews on Sunday, or how often people come to a study or discussion or to serve, don't tell us everything that we need to know about how God is giving the growth. If people here are strengthening their spiritual lives and are thinking deeply, as we did on Common Thursday, about what it means to be a follower of Jesus and how that can and should make a difference in our lives. If we are loving more visibly and compassionately in our actions toward our family, ourselves, and our neighbors, then God is giving growth. But it's hard to see the growth in our spiritual roots. It would be so much easier just to count the number of people in the pews or at an event and call that enough. Like anything that's not easily counted, our spiritual growth, our service, and our ministry are hard to measure. So what do we do? Congregational consultant Dan Hotchkiss suggests in an article entitled How to Measure Ministry that the first and most important principle for measuring ministry is this: ask whether people recommend you. So I'm going to stop here and ask if any of you have eaten out at a restaurant in the last month. Well, okay, we know what you all do. I want you to think about the best dining experience that you've had in this last month. Now, would you recommend that restaurant to me? How many of you would recommend that restaurant? Okay, I'll be looking for restaurant recommendations at coffee hour. How many of you had a bad service experience in the last month or so? Restaurant, service, retail, online? Give me a moment and I could tell you about a couple places to avoid that I experienced on my way back from New York, but I won't. I won't go there. Hotchkiss also continues. This question of asking for a recommendation bypasses many of the judgments, preconceptions, and opinions that only cloud the issue about church. The organist seems competent. The music seems religious. The preacher fits or contradicts my childhood notion of a preacher. Who cares, he says. But the question, would you recommend us, cuts to what he calls every congregation's secret hope, which is to go viral. In communities of faith, the bottom line is not found, sorry Barbara, on the treasurer's report. It's not even about theological correctness. Congregations improve people's lives despite all sorts of deficits and errors, but only if those people show up. And the main reason newcomers and everyone else show up and return is that somebody suggested it. That's reason enough to ask, he says, but there's more. Every time you ask, would you recommend us, Hotchkiss says, you plant a seed. To answer, people have to think, who would I recommend this to? Having thought that, they're halfway there. What a great seed to plant. A recommendation for the ministry we are doing together. Our experiences, as you bear witness, drive our recommendations. But what stops us from sharing a recommendation? Why wouldn't you recommend a restaurant to me? Why wouldn't you? So you had some great dining experiences. The ones you wouldn't recommend, why wouldn't you recommend to me? Poor service. lousy food. Right. So, those kind of things. Why wouldn't you recommend this church or one of our events to a friend? Take a moment and share your thoughts with someone sitting close to you. Why wouldn't you recommend this church or one of our events to a friend? What stops you from recommending us? So anyone care to share why or when you don't recommend, or why you don't talk about church in particular? So you don't talk about because we don't have people of childbearing age with children in this church at the moment. Yeah, okay. Why else don't you talk about church or recommend this church? Tom? So a small church can be a lot of work. So you think people might be afraid of work. Okay. So when you do recommend, a restaurant or a service or a store to someone, when do you do that? I mean, so when you don't, it's lousy food, lousy service. When you do, what particular thing would you recommend? Right, I'm excited about this place. It was a great experience. Okay. Right. So, someone asks. And what makes you overcome any reluctance you might have about making recommendations? And people talk about restaurants all the time. There's not, right? There's not sort of shame. Lyle? Right, it made some memory. I suspect that if we haven't recommended church to someone, we are making assumptions about them, just like you might assume that a vegetarian wouldn't be interested in a butcher shop or a great barbecue place. Or maybe it goes back to that idea I expressed last week that we are somewhat ashamed of being Christians right now in the world. And we assume that people aren't interested. Do we plant the seeds in conversation that church is something we feel good about, that we've made good memories in, that it's something we're excited about? Do we water that interest, our passion, our excitement? You all are here faithfully by extending an invitation to come to church or to participate in an event or a conversation. God will give the growth based in part on what seeds have been scattered on fertile soil. So there are lots of variables. It's February. The seed catalogs are out. And you can buy seed packets at your local garden center. You have the opportunity to plant seeds indoors and then outdoors in a while, and then water them, and God will provide the growth. The germination rate on your seeds will be far higher, however, if you actually buy them and then plant them. Just saying. Just saying. I invite you to plant a seed by asking a friend for a recommendation for an outing, and in turn give them an invitation to come to an event. I've just been planning what we're doing for the next 3 months, and we've got a boatload of wonderful things to do. Whether you come or they come for community, which is why people come to this church often, for music, for spiritual growth, for asking the hard questions, for learning, for moral guidance in these troubled times, for meals together, for support, for the opportunity to serve, for the love we share. Can you recommend us? Plant a seed, water it, and let's see how God gives the growth. In the name of the one who gives life to us all, amen.